Hi everyone, this is your host TCW. In this video I like to show you how to create nested loops with animation nodes concentrating on the very basics. Getting some feedback telling me my last nested loops video is too hard to follow and has too many nodes for a beginner, I decided to create a clear and brief video on that subject. To my experience, teaching or explaining things always is learning things too. And I can tell you, I learned a lot. So here we go. On the screen you see the Blender UI with a 3D viewport on the left and an animation nodes editor on the right. In 3 steps I'll create a set of nested loops to generate a vector list, placing the vectors using the index values of the loops as coordinates, which we can look at with the 3D viewer. So let's start with the first step and let's create the inner loop. As a very first step I need to create a node tree. Now I'm able to add the loop input and let's call it Z loop. And we need a vector list as parameter, because we want to create a vector list, and I also need an append node, which I plug into the list append, and the index goes to the vector element. And let's add a 3D viewer to see what's going on. So our loop is ready, almost ready. We just need to invoke or execute the loop. You see something is happening over at the 3D viewport. I'll increase the viewer width, and you see we've got 2 iterations. We got 2, 3, 4 vectors generated, and the positions are on 0, 1, 2, 3 with 4 iterations, which corresponds to the index values, and I just have to plug over this value to Z because I want to have the Z values generated by the inner loop. And that's our first step. We successfully created the inner loop. And let's continue with the second step. To proceed, we just generate the next loop. Let's call it while loop. Let's add a new parameter. Of course, again, vector list. And we need to add another parameter to the inner loop to take the values of the y coordinates from the outer loop. It's called y integer, and I just have to plug in the index to y integer, plug in the vector list to vector list, and plug in the values to the combine vector node. And I also have to call the outer loop by adding the invoke subprogram node. And now you see the grid is growing in the y direction, and as you might have guessed, we successfully generated our outer loop and completed the second step. Before proceeding to the third step, let me show some annotations, and let's look at the structure a little bit. So here we got the definition of the outer loop, and here we got the definition of the inner loop. And let's add another annotation color. The characteristical structure of nested loops is that you have the execution of the inner loop being a part of the outer loop. So this loop is defined here, and the execution is located over here and contained in the outer loop definition. So with this in mind, let's create our third step, which is another loop, as you might have guessed. No, I don't do this way. Why did I switch it on again? Okay, of course I have to go off the annotation. Let me just copy this loop. No, let me copy this loop. No, let me just copy this one. So I'm saving myself to add a vector list, but I have to add a parameter over here, because we also have to pass on the x values. So I'll call this loop x loop, of course. So, and let's call this one x integer, and we also need a parameter over here. It's of the type integer, and let's call it x integer. So now we are able to continue plugging in the index to y integer, plugging in the vector list to vector list. We also have to plug in the passing over of the parameters. Now we just have to call the outer loop, and as you see, if I increase the iterations, the cube, grid, whatever is growing in the x dimension or x direction. So let's switch on our annotation again. So also here we have our loop definition, and it also contains the execution of the next inner loop, and that's characteristic for nested loops. So yeah, we completed our third step successfully. I hope I could help a little bit. I hope you enjoyed this video. Thanks for watching, and stay tuned to another video on this channel.